Thank you, Kathy. I think it's going to be downhill from here on. It's going to be a big disappointment after Kathy's introduction. Another Kathy Schmidt, invited me some time ago. You know, she's the organizer, as we all know. And she said, would you come up to Traverse City? I said, when? Well, in the winter. I said, I'm going to go up there in the winter? Well, let's compromise and we'll make it March. Okay, but driving all the way? But she got Frank Brady, who is the general chairman of the World Union of Jesuit Alumni, and Tom Cliff, who I met when he was doing his Harvard Law degree way back in the 60s. And they drove me up, so God bless them. Both terrific guys. and talk to Frank about the World Union of Jesuit Alumni event at John Carroll. That's going to be really exciting. It's going to be a wonderful event. I've been to a couple of them. I was to one in Australia, and people came from all over the world, Jesuit alumni. And when you get people together like that, who have the same values, that really helps, especially in this crazy world we live in now. You can really talk cross-cultural, cross-country. So I'd urge you to put it on your calendar. Make a note of it when you get the... Now, the other thing is that Kathy Schmidt is the one that gave me the subject tonight, and that is, how can we follow Pope Francis and the Gospels and still create jobs? Well, you know, boy, what a question, huh? I mean, this is one, frankly, I wish we had much more public policy discussion on in our country and around the world, because it's a head breaker. I mean, it's not an easy one, and I think the tragedy is we don't talk about it. You know, we just don't discuss it. And I think that's to our shame. Well, we got to, well, anyway, I was going to say in politics last summer, we heard about it from both Bernie Sanders and our present president. Yeah. Here's the tension, to put it this way, is, and as Kathy put it in the subject that she picked for me, well, she put it, jobs, consumerism, the gospel, and Pope Francis. You know, where do we go? The tension is clearly between job creation, as we all know from Economics 101. You know, it's consumption that drives production that provides jobs. So if you don't consume, if you don't buy things, I remember after 9/11, George W. said, go out and buy things so the economy doesn't collapse. He could have said so many other things about let's come together as a society and let's find out what's happening. Buy things. Well, it's not that simple. And this certainly goes head to head with Pope Francis, the Gospels, and Catholic social justice principles, because they're pretty clear. They're pretty clear. And I think we can ask even prior to that, what price do we pay for, you know, what I think I'd call excessive consumption? You know, I think we buy too much. Now, we're going to have to talk about a lot of these things. So think of all the questions and issues that you want to raise yourself, and be sure to raise them so we can have a good conversation about this. But, you know, the prices you know as well as I do. Exploitation of resources. Many of the minerals we're having trouble with. Many of the mines, you know, have despoiled the land, polluted the streams, caused problems for people, health problems for people downstream. We know the problem of climate change, global warming, what that's doing to us. And we don't feel the impact anywhere near as much as people in poor countries. Pacific Islands, the Bangladeshis were very close to sea level. The sea's already rising. And some of those people now are climate refugees. And that was the theme. I hope some of you have had a chance to read Laudato Si, Care for Our Common Home of Pope Francis. It's a terrific letter. And it's not that long. I mean, you can finish it. And it's written in a way, you know, maybe when you were in school, especially if you went to a Jesuit school, they made you read papal documents. Well, this is a lot better than most of them. I mean, most of them put you to sleep, but not Francis. I mean, he's really good with it clear in his language. A question we could ask is, what do we need in the way of goods for a happy and a fruitful life? In American society, I think we tend to think that the more money we make, the bigger house, the bigger car, the more successful and the better off we are. We don't fall into that. I'm sure we don't. You folks here, you probably wouldn't be here if you felt that way. But it's a prevalent American attitude. And all of the evidence out there is that more money doesn't bring more happiness, except for people that are at the very bottom. People that are absolute poverty, that they don't know where their next meal is coming from, they don't have a roof over their head. Yeah, more money does bring them more happiness. But after that, it doesn't. A couple of, empirical experiments that were done. One was, some folks followed people who won the lottery in the US. How happy were they compared to their neighbors? Well, right after they win it, they're delighted, euphoria, 6 months later, they aren't particularly. Also, they followed people who, did make a lot of money, and it really didn't affect their basic happiness. This data is out there. I wish we'd learn from it and find out, well, what is it that really does make us happy? There's been a lot of research in the last couple of decades on this, on happiness. There's a couple of books out. I'd even, if you're interested, I'd recommend them to you. Pope Francis, a little bit about what he said in Laudato Si, or I like to call it Care for Our Common Home. That's the subtitle, Care for Our Common Home. He deals with urgent global problems, and particularly, as I said, climate change and the plight of poor people, the marginalized, as he puts it so often. He's got a couple of memorable lines. One is he says, we engage in compulsive consumerism. Now that's interesting, isn't it? Now, and he's talking to the whole world, not just to us in the US. Compulsive consumerism, we gotta go buy things. And of course, advertising encourages us. And, our, keeping up with the neighbors, encourages that. But is it compulsive? And he kind of charges us with often having a me first, wasteful habits, in his words. We think of ourselves first. What's good for me? And boy, that's really true in the U.S. I don't have to tell you folks that. We can talk more about that in a moment. But, we're way off the end on individualism. Pope Francis, in his words, he challenges the myth of unlimited resources and boundless growth. It just doesn't work. We don't have unlimited resources, and we can't have boundless growth. We've got to figure another way of doing it. Now, how we do it, that's the trick. I think that's why Kathy gave me this subject, See, what's he going to say about this? I don't know, we'll see. No guarantees here. He really is, in his words, Pope Francis, it's a moral plea for action that's rooted in human dignity of the individual and common good of the community. So the human dignity of the individual, everybody, you know that from your Catholic social justice principles, no matter who, whether, no matter race, creed, background, handicapped, physically, mentally, whatever, we all have human dignity. We're all, children of God, to be loved and to be respected. And then coupled with that is the common good. And you've heard that, in your Catholic education, the common good. What's good for the group, not just for me. And and that really should be the goal of any government. What's good for the group? What's the common good? And yet we hear so many of our politicians saying, ask yourself, are you better this year, off better this year than you were last year? Well, it's not me. It should be, is your community better off this year than last year? Is the state better off? Is whatever? The group. It's hard for us. Maybe it's nostalgia or something, but it seems to me that's gotten even harder for us in the U.S. to think of what we call the common good in the last couple of decades. But Pope Francis, says that that's absolutely essential. And of course, it's basic to Catholic social justice principles. It's one of the principles. He urges us to have a lifestyle of a simplicity, uh, being and with and helping poor peoples. You know, of all places, the New York Times quoted him just a couple of weeks ago in their lead editorial. Maybe some of you saw that. And it says, you know, you see homeless, you know, on the street. And what do you do? And the editorial writer says, you know, I walk by them in Manhattan. It's hard because there's a lot of them, you know. And he says, but Pope Francis says, whenever you see somebody with their hand out, give them something. And then this guy goes on with that same theme. I'm thinking, here we got the secular New York Times. It's quoting Pope Francis in the lead editorial about being generous to our sisters and brothers. Well, he's winning some converts, not all, obviously, but he's winning some. And of course, he lives it out himself, as you know. He doesn't live in the papal palace. He drives around in a little car, washed the feet of immigrants. And, you know, he brought several Syrian couple immigrant families back to the Vatican when he was in the Middle East. You know, what are some of the causes of the difficulty? Incidentally, if any questions or issues that you'd like to raise, be sure and do it. You know, when I finish, which won't be too long, I don't think. You know, we'll certainly have a time for that also. What are some of the causes, the root causes? I think they're on three levels. Personal problems are a me-first attitude, an individualism, and frankly, greed. You know, selfishness, if you will. And again, we could talk a lot about each of those. And then the other level is the system. We've got a free market system, a capitalist system, which has been terrific in pulling people out of poverty. Some of the critics of Pope Francis says he didn't recognize that. Well, that's not true. He did. In the letter, if you read the letter, you'll see now maybe he didn't give it enough attention, but he certainly recognized it. It's a wonderful system, but the market system doesn't work if it's not regulated. Now, it's a trick. You know, which regulations are effective and needed? You know, and that's another, but it doesn't work. It just doesn't work. I mean, if you didn't have antitrust legislation, for example, where would you be? You know, that's a regulation. And if you didn't have that, you wouldn't have competition. The market is, and that's the most basic level, of course. And the other is, I think we have a global problem now, too, of a new nationalism. You know, we have the Brexit situation where, the UK is leaving the European Union, and now our President Trump is kind of pulling in the bridges, and we're not going to cooperate with other people. You know, I say, wow, I thought we were beyond that. You know, I really thought we were a bigger people, and that we had more of a sense of the value of people, of different nationalities and backgrounds and races. You know, where are we? Well, in a lot of ways, we're stepping backwards. Now, Francis talks about the fragmentation of knowledge, that we don't talk holistically, we don't think holistically, we don't have an integrated sense. Now, you know, one advantage, you folks have had a Jesuit education, so you have liberal arts. You know, a lot of people don't get a liberal education now. I mean, that's basic. Although I have to say, I think I got a better liberal education in my engineering studies than I did in my Jesuit seminary studies. But those poor teachers are all dead and gone now, so they aren't going to come. Well, maybe they will meet me. But that's important, to have an overall view and not to be locked in, you know, to my thing, my discipline, my trade, whatever it may be. And he calls it, we need a larger view. The term he used over and over again in the letter is integral ecology. So that's looking at ecology, the whole globe, every living thing, non-living things too, and looking at them together, not just as a sociologist or a biologist or whatever, but as a whole. And he says that he has some recommendations for persons and governments. He says we need a civic and political love, Pope Francis. Did you ever hear of civic and political love? Wow, that's a new one. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? You know, if we really cared for each other and listened to each other and tried to understand what the other person was saying, even though we didn't agree with them. But too often now we start, this is the US and it's recent, I think, shouting at each other, rather than trying to work things out. And that's, it's not democratic. It's not, well, anyway. Some other points, again, I think you picked up, I think a great deal of Laudato Si, the letter. I think it's just a marvelous piece of work. In fact, I teach both MBAers and undergrad students in the business school, and I've asked them both for the last, since the letter's been out, to read it, and we discuss it in class. And it has an impact on them. And I think it's pretty valuable. For example, in Laudato Si, in its preparation, he had really detailed discussions with social sciences and with natural scientists. I mean, he didn't just write this off of the top of his head. And in fact, one of his consultations in Rome, they had the editor of Science, which is the official journal of the American Association of the Advancement of Science. And when the letter finally came out, also the editor of Nature, which is another major scientific journal, praised it. Both journals praised the quality of the letter and what he had done. Now, he urges, Francis wants us to cooperate more and more in all disciplines and also with every religious community. And after the letter came out, you're probably aware of, rabbis and imams and Hindu, they all came out, and not all, but many came out and said that, this is a marvelous, marvelous letter. There were some critics, and some Catholic critics. You don't have to hear that unless you're interested. You're interested in the critics? But Francis' emphasis on human dignity and the common good is basic. The common good, there's a classic dilemma. Those of you that have had, again, the basic economics 101, they call it the tragedy of the commons. And it comes from New England, really, when, every town back in the 1700s had a commons. And it was a large, even Cambridge, Mass, with Harvard right next door, has the Cambridge Common. There, it was an open pasture land, and, you could use that. So the question is, if you had your own pasture that was a couple miles out of town, and you had this one in town that was public property, which would you use first? Well, I'll save my pasture, for later on, But first I'll let my cattle or sheep, graze on the commons, which of course everybody did. And then pretty much there's no more commons and it's all gone. Well, that's what they mean by the tragedy of the commons. And that's the danger of the way we're treating the globe, that it's a commons and we're just dumping all our refuge and we're using all of the resources. And, who's thinking about future generations or... Anyway, yeah. This is, we've been warned about this, the problems that face our globe for a long time. I'm spending more time on the problems, and less on the jobs. I only have a couple ideas on jobs, but we'll get to them in a minute. We've been warned 40 years ago, maybe, which a lot of you remember, the book Limits to Growth, the Meadows up at MIT, they modeled and they said we're running out of resources. Another book by a guy out at University of Southern California on the name of that was Collapse, and he looked at various cultures and chronicled them that collapsed, and it's because they didn't recognize the limits of the resources. A couple of examples. Easter Island, you probably have seen pictures just off the coast of Chile with the huge statues. They're about 10, 15 feet tall, dramatic, and almost nobody lives there now. Very few people. Well, what happened? The archaeologists have gone back and they found out that it was fully forested in a thriving community. They fished close by. Well, pretty soon they had fished out the area right around them. So they built some canoes and they cut down the trees to build the canoes, and also they cut down the trees to build stuff and to go out further and get, bigger fish and whales. Well, pretty soon they had cut down all of the trees, so nothing, there's no trees on Easter Island now. And they didn't have a way to get to the food, so they did themselves in. The Danish, early, what was it, boy, 1100s on Greenland is another example, but he's got about 10 of these that show that there was a collapse because people, human beings with all our intelligence, we didn't realize we were doing ourselves in. Well, again, this book is not new, it's 10 years old. Okay, what do we do about this? We got a big problem on a lot of levels. The one problem is that we've lost so many decent paying middle class jobs. And I live in Detroit, a lot of you folks know Detroit very well, and of course the jobs in the auto industry were, they weren't always glamorous if you're working on the assembly line, but you made good money. A lot of those are, most of them are gone, not all of them. There still are, some, but a lot of them are gone. Another even clearer example is Amazon. Boy, you don't have to leave your house. You just get on your computer and you can get whatever you want and they ship it to you. Well, they've put all of the local bookstores out of business. And you've probably read too that the working conditions in Amazon are terrible and the pay is terrible. And when they brought this up to Jeff Bezos, he said, gee, that's not the Amazon I know. Well, where you been, buddy? You started it all. Part of it is the problem to the drive to cut costs, which again is the market system, and that's a benefit to all of us. And he's done it. You don't pay taxes on Amazon either, whereas the brick and mortar stores, you got to pay taxes, and is that fair? But that's an example of that. Walmart's another example. Low-cost goods and the working conditions and wages are terrible. And the benefits are terrible at Amazon. They're a little bit better now because they've been embarrassed into increasing the benefits. But then they've reduced the number of their full-time employees and they've taken them just below the level where they have to provide health and pension benefits for them by federal law. But if you look at the richest people in the United States, the 10 richest, 3 of them are Walmart heirs. Sam Walton's kids. I always think, I don't think it ever would have happened if Sam Walton had stayed alive. I think he was a guy who was very sensitive but he's not. It's his heirs and it's run like a machine now. When you run it like a machine, you get into trouble. What are some, these are simple suggestions. It's not going to solve the problem. It might give us a start. But we're beginning to think of locally grown foods as opposed to factory farms and locally grown animals, for meat. Well, we know the conditions, of chickens and, each of those is a separate story. They're giving chickens antibiotics now. And so we get antibiotics, we go to the hospital and, then we're antibiotic resistant if we have a serious infection. That's another whole. I get into all of these side issues. I'm teaching this stuff all the time. That's the problem. But anyway, and we know that local farms employ people. You don't make a lot of money on a farm, but you can support a family, and it can be an enjoyable work for people who like to do it. It's terrific. Same thing with growing animals locally. Social entrepreneurship is another possibility, and you've probably heard that term. The primary example of social entrepreneurship, maybe you've heard of Muhammad Yunus. He was from Bangladesh, got a doctorate at Vanderbilt in economics. He went back to teach in Dhaka, and he went through these very poor neighborhoods. Have you heard this story? It's a great story if you haven't heard it. And they were just dirt poor, families and people. And he went into a couple of the very poor houses, and it was women. And in one case, she was weaving bamboo, making chairs or stools. Well, where do you get the materials? Well, a guy comes by and he will sell me the materials, but he then wants the stool. Well, what do you get for the stool? Almost nothing. Well, would it help if you could buy the materials yourself? Oh, yeah, it would. So he went to the bank and he said, would you loan, these women, not just this one, but a whole group of women? Well, they can't read or write. They have no credit. How could we loan them anything? Well, would you loan them money if I backed it, if I support it? Oh, sure. So he did that for a while. And he thought, well, gee, the banks are making money because they're always repaying, with an interest. And he said, I'm going to start my own bank, which he did, Grameen Bank. Well, to make a long story short, this has affected hundreds of millions of people across the globe, especially in poor countries. Interestingly enough, they will not loan to men. They'll only loan to women. They find that the guys don't pay it back. I always say to my class, does that mean that women are more reliable than guys? It really gets us into a good discussion. But I mean, the reason is that women feel responsibility for the kids. And, the guys often don't. So they learned that when they're going to loan it, they're going to loan it to women. But a local example, a Jesuit, Phil Cook, has just joined our school, University of Detroit Mercy, 2 years ago, and he's starting a program on social entrepreneurship. So he interviews people that want to start their own business, and he will select 9 or 10 in each cohort. And then they'll go through an online course in basic, how you do a budget, how you do business planning, how you do all the basic stuff. And then they come together periodically, and then he has a boost for them. And then they're assigned a mentor, which some of our alums, God bless them, are willing to work with some of these entrepreneurs. So, there have been 10 or 12 new businesses that have started right around the University of Detroit Mercy that are a result of this social entrepreneurship initiative. So I think that's something that's got some legs too. And I think a lot of us are learning to patronize smaller local businesses. Small is beautiful. Remember that book again? That's about 30 or 40 years ago. The British economist, and he got ridiculed for that, even that title, to say nothing of it. Another really radical idea is how about a shorter work week? Do we have to work as long? I mean, in many countries of the world, they don't. I mean, I'm sure you're aware that in France, my golly, they get 6 weeks vacation every year. And now I also know some businessmen, friends of mine, who had operations in France, and they said, I gotta get out of there. I can't get them now. They're not efficient, and I can't fire anybody. Well, yeah, okay, you gotta balance things. But, that's I think we would, oh boy, here's my sermonizing. We would be much happier if we lived a simpler life, enjoyed what we did, worked less, and enjoyed each other. Maybe that's a truism. I see a lot of you nodding your heads. But, we don't talk about that much. And, I wish it were a subject for public policy discussion. But unfortunately, we don't much at all. Well, I guess, a couple of things that have led us into the difficulties we have on individualism in the U.S. And this is, we're coming to the end, so hang on. A couple of social scientists have done work in some 50, 60 countries around the world. And in a whole series of ways, they've measured sense of individualism and sense of community. And of 53 countries, the U.S. is way over on the side of individualism, far more individualistic, really, than any other country in the world. Well, that should tell us something. To try to balance it a little bit with a sense of community. And here's a quote I love. You probably remember the name Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, written in 1835, the Frenchman who came over, and he was going to study the legal system, and he became fascinated with what was happening in America, so he wrote a book about it. And the book is 1835. If you can imagine it, it's a terrific, at least last time I read it, it was a terrific book. I guess that's a while ago, though. that's what happens when you get older. But anyway, a quote of his, he says, individualism at first only saps the virtues of public life, but in the long run, it attacks and destroys all others and is at length absorbed in downright selfishness. Woof, that kind of takes your breath away, doesn't it? And again, this is what, more than 150 years ago. And boy, that's our individualism. And you know, we have to say that individualism is both a strength of American character, because we're flexible. You know, we're able to move in, we get ideas, we're creative. But it's a weakness too. You know, if we can preserve the benefits and try to balance the weaknesses, I think we'd be a lot better off. Again, just as a quick summary, Francis asks us to dialogue with a broader, humanistic, common good point of view of shared goals for people and for the planet. And I think, you know, we've noticed that Pope Francis is really a prophet, and he's recognized as the world moral leader now. I mean, who would ever believe that a pope of the Holy Roman Catholic Church would be a leader, the moral leader of our globe? I mean, the poor Dalai Lama's getting a little old. and who else is there? You know, and thank God that we have Pope Francis at such an important time. Okay, that's me. How about your ideas or comments? Or oh, Norman.
Yeah, I got one question now. What does it mean to be $1 trillion in debt, you know, for a nation? Is that significant? And do other first countries have the same issue? What does it mean? You know, it's got to be a moral issue.
Yeah, interestingly enough, local governments are not allowed to do that. The federal government can, and somebody's got to pay it off. And when we have deficit budgets, it means that somebody in the future is going to have to pay it off. So when we cut taxes and yet continue to spend, you know, we're putting the burden on future generations.
Does it lead to collapse, though?
A what?
Would it lead to collapse, did you mention?
Well, it depends on how strong your economy is and how strong the government is. It can lead to a weakening of the dollar, you know, and yeah, it's not healthy. It's not healthy. And I frankly, I think it's irreasonable. Yeah, you know, when we did in the 2008 the bailouts, you know, that cost what, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of GM, Chrysler, the banks, especially the banks, and we didn't pay that back. But you know, what would have happened to the economy if we hadn't done that? You know, that was a terrible dilemma, just a terrible dilemma. Sure.
On that same subject, though, it strikes me the economy has its own method of trying to bring things back into balance, which we call inflation.
Yeah.
You know, and so you know, if you overspend, you know, inflation is the natural economic consequence, which always affects the poorest people the most.
Yeah, goods cost a lot more. And as a result, you got a little more cash to pay back the previous debt, so you can do that. But you're right, then the poor people going out to buy food and basics, you know, the costs keep going up. Yeah, that's right, exactly.
How can
Sure.
we slow down consumerism so that we're getting closer to being in balance? Is that just because of the greed of the people?
I think it's because we're foolish, we're dumb, we've been duped. You know, I tell my students that. I mean, yeah, I think bottled water and you know, oh God, you know, Abso-Pure, God love them. I mean, Bill Young is a dear friend who owns Abso-Pure, which is the biggest bottled water company, you know. And every time the truck comes in, I think, oh, but I asked Bill one time, I says, you know, how's the business going? He says, well, bottled water business is no good anymore. He says, there's too much competition. But he started another business, Plastipack, which is taking the plastic bottles and other plastics and reformulating. He says, that's where we're doing all right. That, but also we have big trucks of Coca-Cola coming in, you know, and you say, who needs Coca-Cola? I mean, yeah, I know I'm gonna step on toes here, but we've been duped. Yeah, there we go. See? Exhibit number 1.
But we
Sure.
spend 38 billion on soft drinks.
Okay.
And we spend 13 billion on bottled water.
Okay.
But that's a freedom. We allow people to do foolish things. I don't buy much of either.
Yeah.
I never buy bottled
You're
water.
right. You're right.
But I mean, our freedom allows us to do stupid things. The
You're
individual.
right. You're right.
So how do you take that stupidity away from them? You can't.
How do you enlighten people? You know, let's put a positive twist on it.
Yeah, but geez, bottled water, that's not complicated. Just don't buy it.
I know. You know, it is true. I notice our students are shifting more and more to the containers, filling their own containers. And now we have more and more of the, and you probably have a lot of them too, where, you know, in the buildings, public buildings, you can fill your container. Loyola Chicago is a leader on this. They've got 43 water filling stations on campus. And when students come in, they give everybody a refillable bottle and say that students voted 5 years ago that we will not allow bottled water on campus. Yeah. God bless them. But that took a lot of education. The president then, Mike Garanzini, was really committed to it. They've got an institute on environmental stuff, and a lot of activists, you know, and they've gotten the kids interested in. Sure.
One of the things I've noticed is the more we indulge and cause environmental problems, it seems like we'll go through phases where we get a lot of creativity in how to fix some of these problems. I've noticed some posts lately about taking plastics and making roads out of plastics, bottles and all of our waste. What do you think on that?
Well, you want to recycle plastics for sure, and you'd like to recycle them at the same level. The problem is a lot of the plastics are recycled to a lower level. They're made into park benches or,
Right.
you know, foot slabs on the ground. But if you can keep it at the same level, but it still takes a lot of energy to do that. And the question is, do you need that plastic? I mean, look at the styrofoam we use just for packaging. I mean, it's tragic. I mean, it's filling our landfills. Now, that's one thing Walmart did. They decided, they actually got religion when it came to environmental stuff. I mean, there's still, salaries are terrible and so benefits are terrible. But they realized that Al Gore came in and talked to him and showed him his movie and lectured their top management. They've cut back on a lot of the packaging, a lot of the shrink wrap stuff they don't do. It saved them hundreds of millions of dollars. Well, what a great idea, huh? So it's win-win, of course. Yeah, it saves them on materials, it saves them on shipping, it saves them costs all the way around, but
You don't have to recycle.
that you don't have to recycle as much, that's right.
Yeah, you don't use it, you don't have to recycle.
Well, that's right, yeah. You know, a book I'm using with my undergraduates is The Responsible Company by Yvon Chouinard, who founded Patagonia. And he says most of what we buy is crap. You know, these are, you know, a manufacturer of goods. And he says it's low quality, you know, it's to be thrown away. And he says it's really foolish. And they've actually set up a operation now where they will repair their stuff. You know, you ship it out to them and they'll repair it. He said, don't throw it away, repair it. But a lot of the stuff we buy now, you can't repair. You know, it's designed so you can't repair it. A lot of it is pretty cheap. That's part of the problem. You know, you can't take it apart and, you know, and repair it.
I had a question.
Sure, yeah.
Is teaching ethics in colleges, business colleges, is that pretty much mandatory in most universities, or is that?
What a good question. Boy, I've lived through this for how many decades? No. I don't think there's an ethics course now, for example, at Michigan State or Michigan or Wayne State. There's some very good people doing some very responsible stuff at Michigan in the business school, but I don't think they have a mandatory, in fact, story. This is some years ago, 20 years ago, a couple of Fella came in from Michigan, he said, could I come in and talk to you? And I said, yeah, sure, a student. And he said, we're trying to get an ethics course in the curriculum, and could you give us some advice, on how to do it? And so we talked about it for a while. And, well, I knew what he was talking about because a very good friend of mine had taught ethics there. And, he lamented, in fact, he wrote an article about ethics just wasn't respected, among the faculty folks. And we talked about 15 or 20 minutes, and I had another appointment. I said, I'm gonna have to excuse myself. And he said, thank you for talking to me. This is the first time I've talked to a faculty member. He had to come into the University of Detroit then, before Mercy, to talk to a faculty member. Now he repeated that to a GM executive who was a Michigan graduate, and he objected to it. But it's true. Both stories are true. Well, those are anecdotes. I would say now, maybe 1/3 of the business schools in the country have a mandatory ethics or social responsibility course. A much higher percentage of the Jesuit universities do, and almost all of the Jesuit and Catholic schools have something on this. When you get to secular schools, it's a lot thinner going. It really depends on the school. And yet, what may lie behind your question is that, the market system can't work if people don't have a sense of what's right and what's wrong, who are operating in it. Adam Smith said that, the author of The Wealth of Nations. His first book was The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was about the importance of ethics. Well, that never gets any attention, but everybody's always quoting The Wealth of Nations. Sure, John.
Gerald, one of the things I noticed in the room, and of course, Kathy and I have been here for 8 years now, having lived our lives in Detroit, and you look at the scale of Detroit and the nature of justice as relational response within relationship. And so now that we're out here and we see what kind of culture people build, what are jobs here, how much local shopping is there here, it seems like this is a smaller economy and there's more chance for ethics that flows out of a relationship of mutual regard rather than going into a store where there are strangers and where you meet other strangers. And I'm wondering whether there are folks here who have been in a bigger place like Detroit or Chicago and now living here. Do you see anything that gives you a sense of what Father Cavanagh's talking about and those things that make this a more just world and still have jobs?
And how do we parlay it into a bigger deal?
Yeah, my wife and I moved here about 5 years ago after I retired, and we lived in Detroit. We're born in Detroit and lived in Detroit area all our lives. And one of the things that we attracted us to Traverse City was the localness of the whole interaction, that people here in neighborhoods were very interactive with each other. In the stores, people take time to talk and discuss instead of just passing through. Part of it's that I'm retired, so I don't have to rush anymore. So that's a good part of it. So it's different when you're in a business or trying to accomplish.
I'm on a
something
deadline.
in small
I got a
way.
job to do today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in a smaller community, the person that you're dealing with in a store is somebody you're going to see on the street, or in a school or in church or something, and that changes the way you interact. You're part of the community of a whole. Whereas in Detroit or somewhere, you can have these anonymous interactions. And I think that's a big difference. Once you have a personal, if you feel a personal connection, you behave in a more socially responsible manner. I think kinder.
So when I lived in Detroit, I felt very connected to the community. And there were many small businesses. We shopped at the grocery store, we walked to it a couple of blocks away on 6 Mile there, right next to University of Detroit. It was a Jewish grocery store, and they made the best bakery goods and stuff like that. So I really felt there was a community there. Went to Jesu, Beauty High, worked at Lansing Riley Hall, University of Detroit, Mercy, So I felt very good. I thought it was a very good community, but I feel that over time, things changing, and I believe it's changing here in Traverse City, because you're getting the big box stores coming into town, and I believe that that's changing the culture here.
I think it probably depends on someone's economic situation too, so if you have a job you can afford to buy locally or pay more or go to the co-ops and go to the farmer's market, that's one thing, but around here there's so many service jobs, people are making $10 to $15 an hour, and there's a reason why Walmart and Target and Myers serve a purpose for them perhaps, because they could not afford otherwise. So it's a tough balance, because I talk to people at work who say, I wanna go shop there, but I can't. I just don't have the money. So it's a tough balance.
No, that's right.
In your ethics classes, do you talk about the idea of a guaranteed income for everybody?
I mean, the minimum wage.
But above and beyond that sort of thing, but a living stipend for every individual, and then basically as a base level for people, and then people could then, work jobs above and beyond that to increase their,
I teach business students that tend to be pretty conservative, and I'm afraid I'd have a rebellion in class if I even mentioned a guaranteed. But I don't, I'd have to say, yeah, I don't. And in a way, that's a little bit outside the purview, that's more public policy than it is business ethics,
But aren't you the one that influences public?
I try to do everything I can, and if you can give me any hints on how to have an impact, I'd love it. What can I do? I've tried my whole life. And people will say, you've been teaching business ethics for 50 years? Do you feel your life has been a failure? No, not totally. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're correct, but you have to offer, if you don't offer these other things, the information that you have and the knowledge you have.
Well, believe me, everything I've talked about today, I talk about in class. If that's what you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah. Kathy?
I'm wondering too, as far as the student body that you have, talk about millennials, that they're a lot more socially aware, like they don't want to drive cars, they want to, I forget what they call it, but they basically run them, or even their bicycles. Do you sense that in your classes, or do you sense that?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of that. More students are bicycling, to work. Also, we've got a group on campus that John knows, APO, the Student Service Organization, and this is kids that volunteer at least 15 hours a term, just on their own, pure and simple. And that's really the major purpose of the organization. I was with it when it started, and so was John. And we had a handful of kids, maybe 8, 10 kids. Well, now there's more than 100 kids in it, and we have to meet in the biggest classroom, the chemistry lecture room. And we meet every Sunday night at 7 o'clock. And they commit themselves to going to homeless shelters, helping handicapped. That's.
Anybody from St. Francis? Father Rexroth was in that organization.
That's right. We had dinner with Ben. God love him, Father Ben.
Jerry, you had another question way back there, and I see.
Oh, pardon, yeah.
Well, and this is more, it's really not a question, but it's an observation. So, having 7 grandchildren, and when we look at our school systems, and we've shortened school days, and then in terms of the economics, there are very few families that can afford to have only one spouse or one parent working. So they're often 2 parents now working, schools are shortened, people have to pay more for every school event, they're driving all over after hours, there's very little family time. So if a community like Traverse City could test something, so then we could see if it would be scalable, if we would really stop, hit a pause button, and figure how we can reinforce and support families, maybe a longer school day, which would help the business person who is trying to accommodate families picking up children. I mean, it gets to be this very vicious cycle. So, as a community, have you ever seen a community sort of hit the pause button, regroup, and start with the family being central? Because from that point, consumerism does have a different take, sports has a different take, healthcare has a different take, which also adds to the cost. Could we have a healthier community if we made it more about central to family and family life?
Yeah, you're not the only one saying that, of course. The question is how, to do it. And I think families can do it, and groups of families can do it, yeah. I'd say right on.
Systems to support it. We have to,
That's right, yeah, it has to be more than one. If you want to lengthen the school day, yeah. That'd be a bigger policy, a bigger deal. Sure, Cassie.
It seems to me, and I'm interested if you agree with this, that the third and fourth world countries have definitely been better off as a result of American consumerism. Maybe the jobs don't meet our standards, but people are working, and there's less hunger in China and these other countries. So if we as Americans say, we need to help the environment, we don't need all this stuff, I don't need 52 turtlenecks, all of that, would we, in effect, end up hurting those people by reducing our consumerism? Or how do we reduce our consumerism without taking it out on the backs of the people that are just starting to come up in the third and fourth world countries?
Well, that's a good point, of course. Hundreds of millions of people have been pulled out of poverty in China and in India. They still have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions that are still desperately poor. How much of that is because of, imports in the U.S.? I don't know. Now, China actually right now has much better public policy than the U.S. They're building public transit systems like for gangbusters. Takes a lot of jobs. They are really going after sustainable energy. This is sun stuff and wind power. In fact, I don't know if any of you read the New York Times, but there's been a couple of pieces in which, like Tom Friedman had a piece yesterday that says, Trump is an agent of China. Yeah, and then he says, well, we talk about him being an agent of Russia, and we got to investigate that and see if that's true. But two things that he's done, one is the withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because, and I'm still ambiguous about that. Frankly, I guess you'd really have to study it to make up your mind whether it was a good thing or not for the world and for the U.S. But he said when we withdrew, we were the leaders, and we were pushing for decent working conditions, decent standards, labor standards, and environmental standards. Well, now China's taken the leadership. They had an alternate plan, and all the countries that were going into the plan that we were the leader of are joining China, and they don't care nearly as much, about labor standards or wages, minimum wages, or environmental standards. So, an agent of China. Number two is trying to pull back on climate change. And of course, China's in terrible shape on pollution. I'm sure you've seen pictures of people in Beijing and Shanghai, just dead smog and all wearing face masks. So it's a matter of really life and death for them. So they're really going into sustainable energy, renewable energy, with sun stuff and with the wind. And he says that their technology is going to be so far ahead of the United States. And that's where the world is going. They're going to be able to sell this equipment, and we're going to be left behind. Trump is an agent of China. I hope he reads that. I don't know. Yeah.
That assumption that consumerism is helping other third world countries, is that necessarily true? I mean, at the same time, you're disrupting local economies and taking, and maybe making things, a lot worse.
Yeah, that's the terrible dilemma. Almost all of the clothes, shoes, toys, fabrics that we wear are made in sweatshops and literally terrible working conditions. You remember it was in India, the factory that collapsed, it killed 1,100 people. That's just one example. It's happening every day, over and over and over again. And what it is, it's generally young women, younger than teenage, that come into the cities from the farms because they can make money and they'll work, and then they lose their dexterity for the machinery or the clothing, and they toss them out at 25 or 30. And a lot of them have carpal tunnel syndrome and other problems after that. So that's a very good point. Are we really helping, with the way we're dealing with our poorer neighbors? Sure.
Now, you didn't comment at all about corporate tax or regulations. Corporations, highest rate in the world, and we pay the tax, not the corporation. They don't pay any tax because we end up paying the price. And regulations, we have a government that's over-regulating the small guy, and he can't stay in business, so he's forced out of business by the regulations. For instance, in this area, if you're thinking about cherries, well, you're picking cherries, you're not allowed by regulation to eat a cherry. Now, do we really need those kind of regulations? I mean, it just goes on and on with regulations. So the small guy's forced out of business by the government because of regulations quite often. And so the corporate has to take over the bigger guy.
Well, you're right. It's the small business person that suffers most from regulation. And part of the problem is that a big firm can afford to hire somebody that can attend to it, to do the reporting. In a small business, it's really a huge added cost. And it's really tough on them. Now, some of the regulations only apply to organizations that there are over 50 employees. So that's to give the small business a break. But that's a dilemma. Our highest corporate tax rate is 39%. Try to find a corporation that pays 39% tax. I mean, KPMG had a whole division on how you could not pay taxes. They would advertise that. Now, the feds picked them up, and they no longer have that tax division. But in the meantime, for example, for about 5 years, General Electric, during Jack Welch's year as the star CEO, wrote books about him, and he wrote books. They paid no taxes at all, zero, federal taxes. So, again, the big companies can afford to get tax attorneys and tax accountants and avoid the taxes. But, part of my problem with our political system now is that every politician wants to lower your taxes. Well, I mean, aren't taxes the price of a civilization? The price we have to pay for living together. Now, is tax money wasted? Yeah, sure. And you want to, have it as efficient as possible. But, this anti-tax mode, or, Freedom Party, you got to sign a pledge that you will never vote for a tax increase. Say, what? Come on. I mean, aren't we the land of the free and the home of the brave? I mean, where's the freedom if you have to sign a pledge that you'll never raise taxes? Well, now we have three political parties pretty clearly, Democrat, Republican, and the Freedom Party. And where the coalition's gonna go now? This is my prediction. Take it for what you will. Sure.
Well, speaking of, taxes and stuff like that, when you just, it takes, there's limited amount of wealth, we have a lot of wealth in this country, but when it gets concentrated, the more billionaires we make, that must mean a lot of lost jobs and lower paying jobs. Has anybody quantified that? I mean, the high cost of having a billionaire?
Hey, you ought to write a book on that, The High Cost of Billionaires. I like that. Yeah, and then you get the opposite argument. If you took all of that money and spread it out among all the employees, what difference would it make? But, when you got a billionaire, gee whiz. And of course, many of the billionaires make it on hedge funds. They don't really make anything. They don't produce anything. They're not, what are they contributing to society? The best argument you can make is they keep, the system liquid. well, okay, but, yeah, I have a problem with billionaires too. When I raise that in class, my students object. And they say, you know, they earned it. They're the best person, and look what they're doing for the firm. Now, I think in the back of their mind is that, gee, maybe someday I'm gonna be there. I don't know, I'm projecting when I say that.
But how content are they in their lives, their personal lives? It's like we're a very wealthy country, but you go to some other countries and we try to bring them all up to our standards, where they, as people, are usually more content than we are as people.
Very often they have strong communities.
That's what I find very worrisome.
Yeah, they have strong communities, strong family life, and you don't wanna destroy that. No,
But we don't have that anymore. We're so busy making money.
well, yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a part of the difficulty. Yeah. Yeah. I don't wanna bore you people anymore. I don't know what our time limits are here.
We don't have the other rentals coming in tonight.
Don't you?
No.
Oh, heck,
Wait.
midnight?